all protocols observed. Now let me set the tone. My opening keynote is meant to set the tone conceptually and intellectually for this evening's debate. And you've already heard from my colleague that this culture of debating is one we want to take seriously. We will not bring people to King's to just help us, sit on stage whilst people fire questions at them. We want people to think deeply about the challenges we're putting in front of you and to contribute to this debate. That is why those who will contribute to the debate will come on the podium. I want to join Eka Ipe in really welcoming you all to the Africa Week. My opening keynote, I seek to provide some context for the debate, as I said earlier, by providing certain conceptual clarifications and outlining key issues relating to African agency, setting the scene for what will be Ambassador Esipisu's keynote that follows. Let me now put on the table my argument, because we're here this evening to challenge each other deeply. Because we're working, we come from and we work and speak and talk about a continent that is very precious to those who are from there or work there. And I think it's a no-brainer to really say that this is both a challenging moment and a moment of opportunity. I argue, therefore, that we need to begin to challenge the classical conception of agency. I argue it does not capture Africa's realities. What's more, what I describe as the hire, the sale of African agency undermines and stalls the renewal of Africa's agency and the renewal of the continent as a whole, like I said. But at the same time, I want to submit that renewal of Africa's agency is possible. Even at this moment of turbulence in global affairs, there's an opportunity to reposition Africa in a global order that is in flux. So one of the first things I will do 4 things. And the first thing I'll do is to really look at the prevailing context in which the idea of agency is being explored. What does that context look like? It's a context in which there's momentous change. Some of the things we're seeing now are reminiscent of things we might have seen several decades ago. We hope not that it will not be as extreme, but the rules-based international order is being challenged to the core. The institutions established to maintain international peace and security globally, if you like, the United Nations, and regionally, especially the African Union and ECOWAS, they appear to be on the back foot. We have seen how failure to defend established norms, when directly challenged or undermined by members, and perceptions of double standards in particular, in applying declared norms, we've seen how they're eroding global and regional governance. This is the crux of the matter. And we can think of so many examples of this among global institutions and African regional organizations. We now see how Africa's once coveted normative framework, including its continental peace and security architecture, seems to be at odds with today's reality. And what to do about that is partly what we're debating tonight. And it's not going to be the last word of this, but it's worth reflecting on. But at the same time, within this global disorder lies an opportunity for internal renewal and global repositioning for Africa. Reclaiming Africa's agency, and I really use the word reclaiming, because that agency was not always absent in essence. Reclaiming Africa's agency will require both introspection and proactivity on the part of African leaders across all spheres. It also means an interrogation of the structures shaping intra-African affairs and the terms of engagement of the emerging global disorder. This must, however, begin with acknowledging that African agency is caught in an uncertain and an undecided space, if you like, reformed. The uncertainty is really pronounced by the ambiguities about how Africa's voice is projected, how African-led ideas travel, how the continent's human and natural resources are leveraged, and the patterns and terms of Africa's engagement in the global arena. But it is also the case that Africa's engagement in the global arena is strongly mediated by established frameworks that connote particular forms of agency and norms of engagement. Challenging these established ideas and reversing the patterns is the issue that confronts any effort to consolidate or convene Africa's agency in its multidimensional forms for renewal of the continent. So, I said I'll do 4 things. I just set the context broadly. But I want to make 3 key arguments here, which will reinforce what I said at the start. The first is that the classical conception of agency in global affairs does not capture Africa's realities, as I said earlier. That classical view of agency in international relations places Africa in a bind, and it limits the influential expressions of agency and possibilities of renewal of Africa's agency. Of course, our students of IR here, those of security studies, understand this, that when we talk about agency in international relations, we talk about the state, essentially. We talk about agents of the state, and particular kinds of agents of the state are often spoken about. If we sit in the Security Council, we can look at the 3 members that represent Africa as though they will be projecting agency for Africa. I question this very strongly because of the structures that underpin this. Traditional ideas of agency, I suggest, are inherently problematic, making it difficult for African agency to be acknowledged in international relations. Some of our colleagues who are student study, Africans and non-Africans alike, have more or less debated some of this. And Beswick and Hammerstead will tell you that it is the case that in African international relations, scholarship on Africa tends to concern itself with the way in which marginalized, poor, and weak African countries are acted and impacted upon by great powers and international institutions. And in a sense, sometimes this sense of victimhood tends to just dominate the debate. We've seen Brown's work, very elegant, work that talks about African international relations as dominated by a concern to explain how Africa has been governed, shaped, and marginalized by external actors, as though Africa itself does not have agents or actors that marginalize the people. And this is where I want to take us in terms of thinking about agency differently. The challenge with the state and elite-centric view of agency is that where governing elite and people are not at one, right? It is difficult to transfer agency between them. It is not a two-way flow of influence. And I'm not suggesting by any account that there's a two-way flow of influence always in the United Kingdom and the United States. We've seen what happens in these places, but today's conversation is about Africa. The time has come to examine African agency through an expanded interdisciplinary lens. And we have done some work in this area. But I especially like Alex Ntun's work, and here's what he said. It is essential to distinguish between agency for the continent in broad international affairs and agency for specific groups of Africans. In many cases, agency is expressed as resistance, what many external observers dismiss as mindless spoiling, because enhancing agency for elites is in direct tension with agency for the marginalized and disenfranchised. This is the question that I think we need to reflect on carefully. Jonathan Fisher does an interesting thing too, because he reinforces this notion and goes as far as to situate this as a distinction between the meaning of agency and the meaning of what is African. And we need to reflect on that. And much of the discourse really, as I said earlier, is about state and elite agents, but I want to rapidly take us to a place where I think we can begin to say that African agency, to be effective and impactful on the global stage, must draw on the capabilities and qualities of citizens, groups, communities, and states alike. Because only collective agency will do. Africa's renewal depends on this. Of course, collective agency can have both positive and negative outcomes. For the people, asserting influence, as well as the people who are feeling the impact of that assertion of influence. But it requires that all as if everything is brought together to respond to the critical issues that affect the continent. It's not on all issues we will accumulate agency and have collective agency, but on some issues that are so core to the continent, without that collective agency, we will be at sea. And I'm sorry to say that we're almost at sea at the moment, but I am someone that remains optimistic that that collective agency is possible. And we have seen glimpses of this in the past. We've seen it in recent past, I dare say. This produced the African Union's Constitutive Act, ECOWAS new treaty, African peer review mechanism. But I have to say, and others can disagree when it's your turn to contribute, that this has dimmed in the last decade at least, with varying forms of appropriation, of hire and sale of African agency. And therefore my second argument is this, it's my penultimate argument, that the hire and the sale of African agency has greatly undermined Africa on the global stage. But what do I mean by sale or hire of agency? And what are the manifestations of this? And what does renewal look like, if you like? Hiring of agency, I see in the simplest of terms, as speaking to the renting of Africans to boost the image and standing of others on the global stage. Dr. Funmi, a visiting professor, spoke to some of these issues when he gave his public lecture. I think it was in November sometime. It is worth offering those several illustrative examples. One which is increasingly cited as an example of Africa's dependence is the use of summits to convene African governments by countries with great or middle power status. In 2024 alone, we have had, actually already in January, Italy Africa Summit. In June, we will have Korea Africa Summit. We will also then have this year the 9th FOCAC, which is Forum of China-Africa Cooperation. And we will have UK Africa Investment Summit in April. And in the past year, we had France Africa, Russia Africa, Brazil Africa. In a nutshell, it seems the convening of Africa Summit is one of the easiest ways for aspiring middle power countries to confirm their status on the global stage. So if you like, you can just rent African agency when you want to really emerge on the global stage. In sum, this translates into renting the collective agency of African states to announce a nation's acquisition of middle or global power status. What does the sale of African agency represent? There are more economists in this room who are, the economists in this room, they're much better than I to be able to do the analysis of, state-to-state trade and investment. That's not what I'm trying to do. But I just want to say that this represents a conscious decision sometimes, for example, by agents, single agents, not the collective, to auction their resources, personal resources and collective resources for the realization of gains that are not in the overall or long-term interests of the collective. Included in this, actually, is the capturing of African intellectual thought to deliver an agenda, be it ideological, economic, military. A form of, sometimes it becomes a form of intellectual mercenarism. And I'm talking now about academics. So I'm not here, I'm an equal opportunities offender tonight. I'm not just talking about member states, diplomats, non-diplomats. I'm talking about us academics as well, whose ideas shape the theories that we build. Even when they're not relevant to Africa, we conjugate those theories to fit Africa. And actually, on many occasions, I see loads of essays, loads of articles that have many African authors on that subject, but that are rarely quoted, and they're rarely quoted. So that's the sort of thing I'm talking about. At the level of states, one meaning of sale and hire of agency is the capacity for African agency to be influenced by external actors such as major international powers, China and the US, ex-colonial actors such as the United Kingdom and France, their major ties to African nations. Primarily, I'm talking now about the kinds of things we see these days. In fact, Africa is caught in that gap between the East and the West because it has refused to exercise its own agency to emerge as a polar, in international affairs. And that's the point that I'm going to make there. Dr. Funmi also alluded to this during one of his lectures. So, what am I saying? Let me conclude that same issue with at the level of African individuals. Late Peter Da Costa of the African Leadership Center did his doctoral thesis in SWAS. He called it the rule of experts. Because Africans also work at the World Bank, they are in one of these institutions, but actually they spend time trying to help those institutions really impose on Africa particular agendas that will not be there. Not at all times, but the fact is, we've seen what happened with structural adjustment, with the structural adjustment program. Today, we're beginning to see the proximity of African scholars as well, African policy analysts, to the US and UK and France, but also proximity to China. We're seeing the One Belt, One Road initiative and the ideas that are emerging. But what Peter Da Costa is saying, and I will quote that before I go to my point about renewal, is that at the heart of the inquiry is the notion of Africanness as a socially constructed identity amongst experts. It says, my focus on Africa's transnational development regime is aimed at elucidating the ongoing process of identity construction, evident in the deployment of Pan-Africanist discourses, as well as in the emergence of expert-led continental initiatives and arrangements. My claim, he said, is not that African experts working transnationally are setting their African identity as a contrast to Western or global models of development. It goes on and on, but the point is, to leave it there, is that of complexity. The multiple identities show, but without collective agency and the consciousness about that collective agency, we will all serve different masters at different times. So, what do I mean by renewal of African agency? It's about the collective, integrated thinking, approach, action that goes beyond the purview of the state or formal actors to include abundant manifestations of Africa's soft power, such as its creative economies, arts, theatre, innovation, some of which exist in spite of the state, not because of the state. At the same time, we can see collective African agency in the form of resistance, such as youth protests, and that is Nton's point, that you see that thing we call resistance and spoil represents a form of agency. Youth protests, mass youth migration across the Sahara, across the Mediterranean, and the Gulf of Aden. As indicated earlier, collective agency can have both positive and negative outcomes for those asserting influence, as well as those upon whom influence is being asserted, particularly when that assertion of influence is rejected. So imagine both loads of young Africans arriving in Lampedusa and later spreading into Europe on trains and later crossing the English Channel on small boats, but they are not ever well received, and we know that in any of these countries. But whether we like it or not, I submit, it is an expression of African agency and a resistance of exclusive agency by African elite and European allies as well that have borne limited fruit for the vast majority of ordinary Africans. The solution to this must be new thinking and new approaches. It's a wicked problem for which there are no easy answers, such as asking those countries, keep your people inside the country. There's a basis on which they are inside. But for me, when it comes to renewal, regional and sub-regional institutions have the potential to accumulate Africa's collective agency by bringing together common aspirations of peoples and their leaders and a common agenda, for example, on peace, security, and development. As I said earlier 2 decades ago, the African Union and ECOWAS in particular held the promise of collective agency, and they successfully accumulated their common aspirations through sound normative frameworks. We saw how, at the time, as we were young scholars at the time, talking about, alive to the idea that military coups will not be a thing of the day in the continent. And we had the new African Union's Constitutive Act, we had the African Peace and Security Architecture, and ECOWAS, through ECOMOG interventions in Liberia and Sierra Leone, they set the basis for what became responsibility to protect, and a new treaty in 1993. But we've seen how R2P itself has been appropriated in different ways. It's not for me to go there today. But today, What we see is a share of these collective agencies, with ECOWAS and AU unable to stem the tide of military coups, and the latter losing play of its members. And therefore, one question to consider as I begin to wind this down is whether we can have collective agency when captured or semi-captured states seek to lead multilateral institutions. What's more, can representatives of regional and sub-regional institutions who were not elected by the citizens act as an agent for the collective? And without addressing the norm reversal and stagnation that has plagued Africa's continental institutions, we cannot have Africa's self-renewal and a collective agency that serves its peoples, their collective aspirations, and their common goals in the international arena. And therefore, the idea of African agents acting autonomously for the benefit of their individual countries constituting self-renewal is something I doubt. So if you think of Niger recently and its rejection of France, demonstrating a breakdown of France's influence over Nigerian sovereignty, and Nabila Ramdani's work is very good in this area for those who are interested. That the current Niger crisis can thus be linked to former colonial relationships being restructured. But the point Nabila is making is that it is more probable, however, that countries even worse, with worse records of corruption, human rights abuses, and all-round mismanagement, will step in to fill the power vacuum. Because there's not one or three states just in an isolated way withdrawing from the collective. That's not what will accumulate Africa's agency. As terrible as things may have been. That's what I think of this. Some will argue at this moment that in Niger's history, this demonstrates a move towards self-renewal of its agency. Maybe of its agency. But the question is, can the departure of 3 countries from ECOWAS really bring renewal for the continent? And I suggest no. So as I close, my third argument is that there are abundant opportunities in the current climb to reframe African agency towards self-renewal. And one such opportunity is the coming Summit of the Future and the Secretary General's new agenda for peace. And Professor Mahmoud is here, who has written a beautiful paper on this, which we are circulating to our students, but we can share it with anyone that is interested. For my own issue is that it is doubtful, even if highly desirable, that African governments will seize the moment for the reason that Africa must be able to demand certain things and emerge and seize this opportunity. Why do I think it is doubtful? 3 quick things. Can a new form of peace intervention in Africa that replaces the hollow liberal peace agenda be negotiated by Africa? I have not yet seen the sign. Second, in its own internal realm, Africa's multilateral institutions ideally should have elected representatives by the people of Africa. Now you can say I'm dreaming. We haven't yet gotten elections right in the individual countries, and I'm saying when they go to the African Union or ECOWAS, they should be elected. Maybe that's a pipe dream, but it's worth debating in this new era of highly possible technological advancements. But the idea of handpicking people by governments, especially people they do not want to see in their countries, to just go abroad and govern the whole of the continent is woeful at best. African youth, third, must have a collective voice in the future summit that ensures that the collective agency is asserted. We don't even agree on the utility of African youth. Many people see them as violent and never to do well in some countries. And until we have a way of just opening the international stage to the 70% of Africans that are under the age of 40 at this point in time, I'm not sure that we will be ready. So in sum, I'm saying the scene is not yet set for collective agency, but it is never too late. Thank you. To know his profile, versatile in every way. But I just want to give a few highlights because I don't want to assume that everyone knows you, Ambassador. But I want to just read a few highlights of your bio. As you all know, he is the High Commissioner Extraordinary Plenipotentiary of the Republic of Kenya to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and permanent representative to the International Maritime Organization. He's also Kenya's chief diplomat to the Commonwealth Intergovernmental Family of the Commonwealth Secretariat, Commonwealth Foundation, and Commonwealth Executive. As Kenya's top diplomat in the UK, he leads a team dedicated to strengthening bilateral relations around the key pillars of security and defense, mutual prosperity, encompassing trade, investment, climate change, sustainable development, and hosts of other things, including diaspora affairs. He's overseeing a significant outcome of Kenya's fortunes to become the go-to country in sub-Saharan Africa and a significant player in UK-based intergovernmental communities. Amongst a whole range of things that he's done, I think it's worth highlighting that Ambassador Sikisu is one of Kenya's best-known media public figures and has had a long, distinguished career, first as a journalist, journalism trainer and mentor, before growing into an astute communications and public affairs personality and diplomat and an international public servant. I dare say that there are many people from journalism and media background in this room today, several. He also served as special assistant to the President of the African Development Bank. I want to say that he's a frequent speaker on global issues and the author of Eyes of Democracy, the Media and Elections, which chronicles the experiences of journalists and observers in calling elections. In 2022, Kenyan President, Excellency Dr. William Ruto, CGH, bestowed on Ambassador Sikisu the civilian honor of Elder of the Order of the Burning Spear, EBS, for his distinguished services to public affairs and diplomacy. Most of you from Kenya have lived there for a short period of knows what that means. It is the highest honor in the land. Ambassador, you're welcome.